In the last lecture, we saw how the phenomenon of vagueness gives rise to a kind of fallacy that we called a conceptual slippery slope. Today, we're going to see how that same phenomenon of vagueness gives rise to another kind of fallacy. This kind of fallacy we're going to call the fairness slippery slope. It's also a kind of slippery slope argument, but it concerns fairness. Okay, so what's a fairness slippery slope argument? Well, here's the definition. A fairness slippery slope argument is one that exploits the vagueness of a category to argue that it's unfair to treat cases that fall into that category differently from cases that don't fall into that category. So, what's an example of that? Here's one example. So, suppose I argue as follows. Premise 1, a person who scores 100% on the exam passes. Right? If any score passes, 100% must pass. So, let's suppose a person who scores 100% on the exam passes. Well, a difference of 0.01% is not a significant difference. Therefore, the argument concludes, it's not fair to fail someone who scores a 10% on the exam. In fact, it's not fair to fail someone who scores a 0% on the exam. Now, how does that thinking go? Well, it goes like this. If a person who scores 100% passes, and there's no significant difference between a person who scores 100% and a person who scores 99.99%, then it's not fair to fail someone who scores 99.99%. But then for the same reason, it's also not going to be fair to fail someone who scores 99.98%. And then, for the same reason, it's not going to be fair to fail someone who scores 99.97%. And so on, all the way down the scale. Right? It can't be fair to fail them because there's no significant difference between that score and a score that's 0.01% higher. So that's a fairness slippery slope argument. Now, why is this a fallacy? Well, it's a fallacy because it assumes that it can't be fair to fail someone whose score is not significantly different from a passing score. Right? If a score of 70% is passing, then by premise 2, a score of 69.99% is not significantly different from that. But it doesn't follow, just because 69.99% is not significantly different from 70%, it doesn't follow that it's not fair to fail someone who got a 69.99%. It could perfectly well be fair to fail them, for all the two premises say. Right? Fairness doesn't necessarily go with significant differences. It could go, let's say, with predictable differences. Right? If I tell you in advance that the minimum score for passing the test is 70%, then even though there's not a significant difference between 69.99% and 70%, still, you knew in advance that 70% was the minimum score for passing the test. So if you get a 69.99%, it might be fair to fail you, even though that score is not significantly different from 70%. Okay, so that's why fairness slippery slope arguments are fallacies. They're fallacies because they assume something that might not be true, which is that it can't be fair to fail someone who has a score that's not significantly different from a passing score. So that's why these are fallacies. Let's look at another example. So premise 1, a 9-month-old human fetus, let's say a human fetus that's almost to its due date, or maybe on its due date, has a right to live. I think we might all agree with that. Premise 2, a difference of 1 minute of prenatal development is not a significant difference. We might all agree with that too. Conclusion of this fairness slippery slope argument, it's not fair to deny a fertilized egg the right to live. Okay, but once again, that doesn't follow from the premises, right? I'm not saying it's not true. The conclusion of that argument might, for all I'm going to say today, might very well be true. My point is not whether it's true or false. My point is that the conclusion is not supported by the premises. And the reason it's not supported by the premises is because this argument assumes again, that it can't be fair to deny a prenatal life the right to live if it's not significantly different from a prenatal life that does have the right to live. Again, it assumes that differences in fair treatment have to be significant differences. And again, that might very well not be true. So that's why this is a fairness slippery slope argument. That's why this is a fallacy. Okay, now let me say in general, when someone gives a fairness slippery slope argument in ordinary life, they usually don't lay it out in the way that I'm laying out these arguments. Usually what they do is say something like, well, where do you draw the line? Where that question is not understood so much as a sincere question as rather a pointed question. It's a question they're asking of which is simply an attempt to make a point. They're simply trying to make a point that there's no reasonable way to draw a line that needs to be drawn. So in asking that question, someone is in effect assuming that because little differences are not significant, it can't be fair to treat those slightly different cases, those insignificantly different cases, differently. So when you hear someone ask, where do you draw the line? Often you should beware, because a fairness slippery slope fallacy might be lurking in the midst. Okay, see you next time.